biggest myth we need to dispel is that you should underexpose Apple log by one stop and use the lowest ISO possible. Footage looks weird after setting your exposure manually. It may not be your fault. The false color is completely broken. So let's look at this. This is supposed to be 18% gray, but that is very underexposed. And then for good measure, I went ahead and covered the camera. So needless to say, with Apple log, false color is broken. Actually, it's more confusing because your clipping point will adjust according to your shutter speed if you are setting it manually or if you're setting it via auto. I mean, I don't understand how your shutter speed could affect anything like this.
I tell you right now, ISO 400's clip point is not there. If I bring this down, it's going to immediately drop it to roughly 80-something% IRE. Until I hit again to go to auto. And then up it goes, accurately displaying in the histogram and traffic light.
False color, as you saw, is inoperable and inaccurate and will absolutely lead you to underexpose your footage, disastrously so. Traffic lights won't work for a variety of reasons, one of which is because Apple log's clipping point is not very high. This is not uncommon with a lot of log profiles. The difference is that usually that's on a dedicated camera where your tools will accurately represent if you're clipping within that log profile. Your histogram will work, but it is not properly scaled. You just need to be aware that the clipping point will move dependent on ISO. Here's the thing that I found is that there's no real place to find the clip points dependent on ISO. So I went ahead and made a white paper that has those. White paper sounds bold. I have a reference cheat sheet that I am not legally binded by. I did the best I could to have the most accurate results possible so that you could safely and repeatably know where to set your zebras and have your highlights protected. And then if zebras isn't your bag, I created a LUT pack. I created a pack that is all technical LUTs. So basically I have a traffic light LUT, false color LUT, and then they range within each ISO. One of the things that I haven't seen really discussed is how high the middle gray point for Apple log actually is. It sits at 50% IRE, which is high for a log profile. Most profiles sit at 40% gray, 40% middle gray, or perhaps even lower in the case of log C4. So having it at 50% IRE is actually pretty high, which can cause your subject to look underexposed. Like looking here, this is traditional 40% mid-gray on this coffee cup, but that looks dim compared to when we switch to manufacturer middle gray. That's behaving much more like you would expect middle gray after being transformed into Rec 709 to look. And then let's compare cameras that have a lower mid-gray, like the Blackmagic Gen 5, which mid-gray is 40%, and look how much more vivid that looks when you compare the two of them together. Apple log subject looks dull. And then here's Apple log at manufacturer middle gray. Again, they're sitting right where you would expect them to after a Rec 709 transform. I think the best ISO to use is ISO 1600. 16 is noisier and less sharp, but this is 1600 ISO right now. Is it too noisy for you? I am overexposing by a good stop and a half, if not more, on my skin tones, but I'm also keeping that window exposed and my shadows are above the noise floor. And that's awesome. If you look at any of the behind the scenes on the Apple press conference that they shot with the iPhone 15, you can see that in their sets, they are shooting at 55 ISO. And I don't disagree with that. Obviously, these are some of the world's finest technicians. So obviously, they're filming at 55 ISO for a specific reason. One of which is that they are shooting in a studio and had complete control of the levels within the image. So they weren't fighting the sun coming in and trying to expose against it. I'm not saying you're getting more or less dynamic range than what Gerald Undone already said, which was about 2 stops. What I'm saying is I'm ETTRing, but I'm going to create a dark image out of it. And by doing that, I'm bringing that noise floor back down. I think there's a lot of reasons why folks have suggested underexposing Apple log. And I think what it comes to is the misunderstanding of middle gray and the capped highlight range of ISO 100 to 400, right? Or even lower if you're at ISO 55. Because look at this histogram. This image is ETTR'd. This is all the way to the right of ISO 100. If I went any further to the right, that point on the right-hand side would start clipping. Does that look overexposed to you? No. This is what ETTR typically looks like when you pull it out of camera and apply a Rec 709 transform. The exposure intentionally sits very high within the waveform. Comparing the two of them, it's night and day. I mean, just look at the amount of information that you can skew into the top half of the image. And then when you grade your exposure down to where you want it in terms of your final grade, you can see, I mean, this is a very clean image that is left over, just like every other log profile out there. And that's why exposing to the right is so commonly used when discussing log formats. And we can look at these two images here. This is 1600 and 100 side by side. Now we're going to go to some charts, and they have been overlaid with the curve of Apple log. And you can see at ISO 100, the toe of the log curve is starting to crush out the details at the lowest part of the image. But at 1600, as you can see, there's far more information down by the toe. What you can really see the benefit is where you set your highlights at. You have increase in that dynamic range, but also look in these lower shadow regions. At the ISO 100, that is just one skew of information. There's no granularity there at all. It's all been compressed down. And maybe we can stretch that out with our tools. But if you look at ISO 1600, there's so much more granularity within those shadows because it hasn't been compressed by the toe yet. And we now, instead of expanding the image, we get to compress the image down. So it's less of a destructive act. And there's so much more granularity within those shadow regions that would have been lost because they are all being compressed down and then scrubbed of detail because of the internal noise reduction that the iPhone is doing. It's kind of a double whammy of lost information. And additionally, this iPhone has such a small sensor. Don't starve it for light. So I understand why that underexpose by a stop became kind of the gold standard, but it's inaccurate. So since we have the tools to set our ISO, let's start using them. What else is there?